my God, T, you kept the baby? Oh my goodness. Tiana, please wait.
Those were the words that came out of Chandler's mouth when he saw his ex-wife, Tiana. It had been 8 months since Chandler signed those divorce papers. 8 months since he walked out of their Pasadena condo, convinced he was protecting his future. 8 months since he told Tiana that their marriage was over because she refused to terminate her pregnancy. That Saturday morning, as he sat at a red light on Lake Shore Avenue in Oakland, his entire world collapsed in a single moment. He had been driving back from a business meeting, mind occupied with investor metrics and product timelines, when he glanced absently to his right. There, standing on the sidewalk waiting to cross, was Tiana, still poised, still beautiful, still carrying herself with that quiet strength he once admired. Except now she had a stroller in front of her, and when he looked closer, he could see a tiny infant nestled inside with a head full of dark curls. And in that instant, as their eyes met through the car window, Chandler understood something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She had never gotten the abortion. The child in that stroller was his, and he had abandoned them both based on an assumption he never bothered to verify. Before we continue with Chandler's story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let's get to it. Chandler had always been the kind of man who believed he had it all figured out. He had built a thriving tech startup from scratch, secured 3 rounds of venture capital funding, and prided himself on his ability to think strategically and execute decisively. When he met Tiana 6 years earlier at a tech networking event in San Francisco, he was immediately drawn to her creative energy and genuine warmth. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, running her own small business from home, and had this way of seeing beauty and possibility in things other people overlooked. They dated for 18 months before getting married in an intimate ceremony overlooking the Pacific coastline. For the first 4 years of their marriage, everything seemed perfect. They moved into a beautiful condo in Pasadena, took weekend trips to wine country, and talked often about building a life together. But somewhere along the way, Chandler had started to change. His startup became more demanding, requiring constant attention and endless hustling for the next investment round. He began spending less time at home and more time in strategy meetings, investor pitches, and networking events. Tiana noticed the shift but remained patient, believing it was just a temporary phase while he built the company. The first real crack in their marriage appeared when Tiana started talking about having children. She was 32 years old and felt ready to start a family. Chandler, however, kept deflecting. He would say they needed to wait until after the Series B funding round, or until the company reached profitability, or until they had a bigger home. The truth was Chandler had become attached to their lifestyle exactly as it was. He enjoyed the freedom to work until midnight without guilt, to fly to conferences on short notice, to pour every resource into scaling his business. A child would disrupt everything, and he was not ready for that disruption. Tiana tried to be understanding, but as months turned into years, her patience began to fade. They started having the same painful conversation over and over, each time leaving both of them frustrated and disconnected. Chandler would accuse her of not understanding the pressure he was under, while Tiana would remind him that they had always talked about having a family someday. The emotional distance between them grew wider with each passing month. Then one evening in early March, Tiana came home from a client meeting looking anxious and overwhelmed. Chandler was at the kitchen table reviewing pitch deck revisions for an upcoming investor presentation. She sat down across from him, took a shaky breath, and said the words that would change everything. She was pregnant. 6 weeks along, confirmed by her doctor that afternoon. Chandler felt his stomach drop. His first reaction was not joy or even surprise, but pure panic. This was not part of his roadmap. He had a major product launch scheduled in 2 months that would require his complete focus. He had just committed to hiring 10 new engineers that would strain their finances. A baby did not fit anywhere into his carefully constructed plans. He looked at Tiana and saw hope flickering in her eyes, maybe even cautious excitement, despite her obvious worry about his reaction. But instead of meeting her vulnerability with compassion, Chandler went cold. He told her they needed to think about this rationally. They were not prepared financially or emotionally. His company was at a make-or-break stage. They had been drifting apart for months. How could they bring a child into this situation? Tiana's face fell. She had expected shock, maybe even fear, but not this clinical detachment. She told him this was not just about business metrics and timing. This was their child, a life they had created together. She wanted to keep the baby. Chandler felt cornered. Over the next 3 weeks, their conversations became increasingly bitter and painful. Chandler kept pushing for what he called the logical solution. Terminating the pregnancy would give them space to stabilize their marriage first, to have a child later when they were truly ready. He framed it as the responsible choice, the mature decision that prioritized their existing commitments. But Tiana refused to consider it. She told him she understood his fears, but that she had always wanted to be a mother, and she was not going to end this pregnancy just because it disrupted his startup timeline. Chandler grew resentful. He felt like she was making a unilateral decision that would derail both of their lives. In his mind, she was being emotional and unreasonable. The more firmly she stood her ground, the angrier he became. One night, after another exhausting argument that went nowhere, Chandler said something he could never take back. He told Tiana that if she refused to have an abortion, he wanted a divorce. He could not be a father right now, and he would not be forced into it against his will. Tiana stared at him in stunned silence. She had known he was scared and overwhelmed, but she had never imagined he would actually walk away over this. She asked him if he was serious, if he was really willing to throw away 6 years of marriage because she wanted to keep their baby. Chandler, too proud and too angry to back down, said yes. He told her she had a choice to make. Either she terminated the pregnancy and they could try to rebuild their marriage, or she kept it, and he was done. He genuinely believed he was presenting an ultimatum that would force her to see reason. But Tiana simply nodded slowly, tears sliding down her face, and said she would not end her child's life to keep him. If that was his condition for staying, then he should leave. Chandler moved out 4 days later. The argument that ended their marriage happened on a Thursday night in mid-March, exactly 2 weeks after Tiana first told him about the pregnancy. Those 14 days had been suffocating, filled with tense silences and careful avoidance. They moved around each other like strangers sharing a hotel room, each afraid to trigger the conversation neither of them wanted to have again. Chandler had spent those 2 weeks running calculations in his head. He had spreadsheets for everything: projected burn rate for the next 18 months, childcare costs, medical expenses, the impact on Tiana's freelance income during maternity leave. Every number pointed to the same conclusion: this was the worst possible timing. His company was bleeding cash while they waited for the Series B funding to close. He had personally guaranteed a line of credit to make payroll. 3 of his engineers had already quit to join a competitor. The product launch in May was their last chance to prove viability to investors. If they failed, everything he had built over the past 4 years would collapse. And beyond the finances, there was the simple brutal truth he could barely admit to himself: he did not want to be a father. Not now. Maybe not ever. The idea of being responsible for another human life, of sacrificing his freedom and focus, of becoming one of those exhausted parents he saw at coffee shops staring blankly at their phones while their kids threw tantrums, filled him with a cold dread he could not shake. Tiana had spent those same 2 weeks researching. She read articles about first trimester nutrition, looked at online forums for expectant mothers, and bookmarked websites about preparing for a baby on a budget. She had also been watching Chandler retreat further into himself, his face growing harder and more distant each day. She knew what he was thinking even though he had not said it outright since that first terrible conversation. But she had made her decision. She was keeping this baby, with or without him. That Thursday evening, Chandler came home late from a particularly brutal investor meeting where he had been grilled for 3 hours about their user retention metrics. He found Tiana in the living room, her laptop open to a prenatal vitamin comparison chart. The sight of it made something snap inside him. He could not keep pretending this was going to work itself out. He sat down across from her and told her they needed to make a final decision. His voice was steady, almost businesslike, as if he were negotiating a contract term. He walked her through his analysis again, this time with more detail. The funding round was uncertain and might fall through entirely. If that happened, he would need to lay off half the team and probably take a significant pay cut himself. They had maybe 6 months of savings, and that was before adding any baby-related expenses. His health insurance through the startup had a high deductible that would leave them with thousands in out-of-pocket costs for the delivery alone. And beyond the money, there was the reality that he would need to be traveling constantly over the next year to meet with investors, partners, and potential acquirers. He would not be present. He would not be available. He would be a terrible father because his attention would be divided, and both Tiana and the baby would end up resenting him for it. Tiana listened without interrupting, her hands folded protectively over her still flat stomach. When he finally finished his presentation, she asked him quietly if he had spent even 1 minute during the past 2 weeks thinking about this baby as a person rather than as a financial liability. She told him she understood the timing was difficult, that she knew the startup was consuming him, but that plenty of people had built careers while raising children. It required sacrifice and adjustment, but it was possible. And more importantly, this was not just his decision to make. This was her body, her life, and her child too. Chandler felt his carefully constructed logic beginning to crumble under the weight of her simple truth, and it made him defensive. He told her he was not trying to control her body, he was trying to be realistic about their situation. He had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let everything fall apart now because of one unplanned pregnancy. He said the word unplanned with particular emphasis, as if that fact alone invalidated the pregnancy's legitimacy. Tiana's eyes hardened. She told him she had spent the past 2 weeks hoping he would come around, hoping the fear would fade and he would see this as the blessing she believed it was. But she realized now that he did not want this child at all. It was not about timing or finances or the startup. He simply did not want to be a father, and no amount of perfect circumstances would change that. She asked him directly, if she had this baby, would he stay? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unavoidable. Chandler felt trapped. Part of him wanted to lie, to say yes and buy himself more time to figure it out. But a larger part of him, the part that prided itself on honesty and directness in business dealings, could not bring himself to make a promise he knew he would not keep. He told her the truth. If she went through with this pregnancy, he did not see how their marriage could survive. He would feel obligated and resentful. He would fail as a husband and as a father. It would be better for everyone if they faced reality now rather than dragging out the inevitable. Tiana absorbed this with a strange calm that frightened him more than tears would have. She nodded slowly and told him she appreciated his honesty. Then she said something that would echo in his mind for years to come. She told him he was right about one thing. He would be a terrible father, not because of his schedule or his finances, but because he had already chosen to abandon his child before she was even born. She said she would not beg him to stay, would not try to convince him to want something he clearly did not want. But she would not terminate this pregnancy to save a marriage that was already over. Chandler stood up, feeling both relieved and hollowed out. He told her he would move out by the weekend and that his lawyer would be in touch about the divorce papers. He said it calmly, as if he were announcing his resignation from a job rather than the end of their life together. Tiana just looked at him with an expression he could not read, something between pity and disappointment and a deep sadness that went beyond anger. He packed 2 suitcases that night while she was in the shower. By Friday afternoon, he had signed a 6-month lease on a furnished loft in downtown Los Angeles, 17 miles and a world away from the life he was leaving behind. He told himself he was making the rational choice, the honest choice, the choice that would hurt less in the long run. He told himself that Tiana would eventually understand and that once she was not pregnant anymore, they could both move on and find happiness separately. What he did not allow himself to consider, not even for a moment, was the possibility that she would go through with it. That she would carry the baby to term, give birth alone, and raise his child without him. He assumed that once she faced the reality of single motherhood, the financial pressure, the loneliness, and the sheer physical exhaustion of pregnancy without a partner, she would reconsider. He assumed she would call him, voice small and defeated, and tell him she had scheduled the procedure. He assumed wrong. The loft in downtown Los Angeles was everything Chandler told himself he needed. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, exposed brick walls, a kitchen he would never use, and most importantly, no memories. The building was modern and anonymous, filled with other young professionals who worked late and kept to themselves. He signed the lease without negotiating, paid 6 months up front, and moved in with nothing but his 2 suitcases, his laptop, and a determination to prove he had made the right decision. The first week felt almost liberating. He worked until 2 in the morning without anyone asking when he was coming to bed. He took calls from investors at 7 on Sunday morning without feeling guilty about waking anyone up. He ordered takeout for every meal and left the containers stacked on the counter because there was no one there to care. He told himself this was what he needed, this freedom to operate without compromise or consideration. This was how successful founders lived during the critical growth phase. Unencumbered, focused, ruthless in their priorities. He crafted his story carefully before telling anyone. When his business partner Darius Turner asked about Tiana over coffee one morning, Chandler delivered the narrative he had rehearsed. They had grown apart over the past year. Different priorities, different visions for the future. It was mutual and amicable, the kind of conscious uncoupling that mature adults engaged in when they realized they wanted different things. Darius nodded sympathetically and said he respected them both for recognizing it before things got messy. Chandler let him believe that version, grateful he did not have to explain the truth. He told the same sanitized story to investors, to his small team of engineers, to the few friends who asked. No one needed to know about the pregnancy or the ultimatum or the way Tiana had looked at him that last night. That was private, irrelevant to the professional relationships he needed to maintain. And more importantly, shaping the narrative this way allowed him to avoid the judgment he knew would come if people understood what he had really done. He was not a villain in this story. He was simply a man who had made a difficult but rational choice about his future. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks after he moved out. Tiana had filed quickly and efficiently, checking the box for irreconcilable differences and requesting no spousal support. She wanted a clean split of assets. She would keep the Pasadena condo since her business was based there, and he would take the majority of their savings since he had contributed more of it. It was fair, straightforward, and cold. Chandler signed everything the same day and sent it back through his lawyer. He felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness as he dropped the envelope in the outgoing mail. This was really happening. There was no going back now. What he did not do, in all those weeks, was reach out to Tiana directly. He blocked her number the day after he moved out, telling himself it was necessary to maintain boundaries and avoid the emotional manipulation he was certain would come. She would try to guilt him, to appeal to his sense of obligation, to make him feel like a monster for choosing himself. He could not afford that distraction, not when he was in the middle of the most important fundraising push of his career. So he created a wall of silence between them, filtered all communication through lawyers, and convinced himself that no news was confirmation of his assumptions. Because in his mind, the script was clear. Tiana would realize within a few weeks that she could not do this alone. She would go to a prenatal appointment and hear about all the risks and complications. She would look at her bank account and understand that her freelance income could not support a child. She would spend a night awake at 3 in the morning, terrified and exhausted, and finally admit to herself that he had been right. Then she would make the appointment, take care of it quietly, and they would both move forward with their separate lives. He had given her an out. She just needed time to take it. This assumption became a kind of background operating system in his mind, humming quietly beneath everything else. It allowed him to throw himself into work without guilt because the situation was temporary and self-correcting. It allowed him to sleep at night because he had not actually abandoned anyone. He had simply declined to participate in a choice that was being unmade anyway. It allowed him to sit in pitch meetings and talk about scaling and growth and long-term vision without the cognitive dissonance of knowing he had walked away from the most fundamental responsibility a person could have. The Series B funding round consumed him completely. He spent April and May in a blur of investor meetings, term sheet negotiations, and all-hands presentations to keep his team motivated while everything hung in the balance. He flew to San Francisco twice a week, took meetings in coffee shops and hotel lobbies, revised his pitch deck 17 times based on feedback from venture capitalists who all seemed to want something slightly different. His co-founder Darius handled product development, while Chandler focused entirely on the money. They needed $8 million to survive the next 18 months. Anything less, and they would have to start planning an exit strategy. By mid-June, they had commitments for $6.5 million from 3 different firms. It was not everything they had hoped for, but it was enough. Chandler celebrated with his team at an expensive steakhouse in downtown LA, buying rounds of drinks and giving an impromptu speech about resilience and vision and the importance of betting on yourself. He felt vindicated. This was what mattered. This was what he had protected by making the hard choice back in March. If he had stayed, if he had let himself get dragged into the chaos of impending fatherhood, none of this would have been possible. He hired aggressively through July and August, bringing on 2 senior engineers, a product manager, and a head of sales. The office energy shifted from desperate survival mode to cautious optimism. They had runway now, breathing room to actually build the features their users had been requesting. Chandler worked longer hours than ever, arriving at 7 in the morning and leaving after 10 most nights. He dated casually, going out with a marketing consultant he met at a networking event and a designer one of his engineers introduced him to. Nothing serious, nothing that required emotional investment. Just dinner and conversation and the validation that he was still young and unattached and in control of his own life. He did not think about Tiana. Or more accurately, he did not allow himself to think about her for more than a few seconds at a time. When the thought appeared, usually late at night when he was alone in the loft, he would redirect his attention to work, to email, to anything that kept him from following that thread all the way to its conclusion. He assumed she had handled it by now. He assumed the pregnancy was no longer an issue. He assumed that if something had gone wrong, if she had needed him for any reason, she would have found a way to reach him despite the blocked number. He assumed that silence meant resolution. He assumed that moving forward with his life was proof that he had made the right call. He assumed he knew how the story would end. And for 8 months, those assumptions allowed him to sleep at night, to look at himself in the mirror each morning, and to believe he was still fundamentally a good person who had simply chosen himself when the alternative would have destroyed everything he had worked for. But assumptions, no matter how carefully constructed or desperately clung to, are not the same as truth. And the truth was about to find him on a Saturday morning in November, in the most ordinary of places, at a red light on a busy Oakland street while he was driving back from a business meeting. The truth was about to shatter every single lie he had told himself. And unlike his business problems, unlike his investor pitches and product roadmaps and carefully managed narratives, this truth could not be controlled, could not be spun, and could not be undone. The business meeting in Oakland had run longer than expected. Chandler had been discussing a potential partnership with a software company based near Lake Merritt, and by the time he left their offices, it was nearly noon. He was driving back toward the freeway, his mind still processing the terms they had discussed, when he approached the intersection at Lake Shore Avenue. The November morning was perfect, the kind of fall day that made people forget California had seasons. Golden light poured through his windshield, and he could see joggers and cyclists enjoying the mild weather along the lake. He slowed as the traffic light ahead turned yellow, then red, and came to a stop. He was reaching for his phone to check messages when movement on the sidewalk to his right caught his attention. He glanced over casually, and his entire world stopped. Time did not slow down the way it does in movies. There was no dramatic music or soft focus or moment of recognition that built gradually. It was instant and devastating. Tiana was standing on the sidewalk just feet from his car window, waiting to cross the street, and even before his brain fully registered who she was, his body knew. His breath caught. His hands went cold. And then the details flooded in all at once. She looked different. Tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep, but also stronger somehow, more solid in herself. She was wearing a burgundy wrap dress that he did not recognize, her hair pulled back in a simple style. And there, in front of her, was a stroller. A real stroller, the expensive kind with all-terrain wheels that serious parents bought. But that was not what made his knees go weak. What destroyed him completely was when he leaned forward slightly and saw inside that stroller, a tiny infant with a head full of dark curls, nestled in blankets, real and alive and his. The world tilted. Everything he had assumed, everything he had built his last 8 months on, every story he had told himself to justify his choices, collapsed in the space of a single heartbeat. She had not terminated the pregnancy. She had carried the baby to term. She had given birth. That child, that living, breathing infant in that stroller, was his daughter. And he had not been there for any of it. Tiana must have felt his stare because she looked up, and their eyes met through his car window. Chandler watched her entire body go rigid with recognition. Her hand moved instinctively to grip the stroller handle tighter, a protective gesture that sent a spike of shame through his chest. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, frozen in a bubble of mutual shock while cars idled around him and pedestrians moved past her on the sidewalk. Then something shifted in Tiana's face. The initial surprise hardened into something else, something cold and resolved. She checked the stroller straps with deliberate care, lifted her chin with a kind of quiet dignity he had always admired in her, and turned to walk back down the sidewalk away from the intersection. She was going to leave. She was going to take his daughter and disappear back into whatever life she had built without him, and he would lose even this terrible moment of knowing. Chandler's body moved before his mind caught up. The light was still red, but he threw his car into park right there in the middle of the lane, ignoring the confused looks from the driver behind him. He flung open his door and stumbled out onto the street, his heart hammering against his ribs. A car honked. Someone yelled something about blocking traffic. None of it registered. All he could see was Tiana's back moving away from him down the sidewalk, the stroller rolling smoothly ahead of her. He called her name, his voice coming out rough and desperate. She did not stop. He called again, louder this time, and several people on the sidewalk turned to look at him. Tiana's shoulders tensed, but she kept walking, pushing the stroller with determined purpose. Chandler broke into a jog, closing the distance between them, and finally managed to get in front of her, blocking her path near a coffee shop entrance. Up close, the reality was even more devastating. He looked down into the stroller, and the baby was real, solid, perfect. Maybe 8 or 9 weeks old based on her size, with Tiana's warm skin tone and what looked like his nose and chin. She was wearing a tiny yellow outfit with ducks on it, and her eyes were closed in sleep, her mouth slightly open in that way newborns had. Chandler felt like he was going to be sick. Tiana stopped because she had no choice, but her expression was glacial. She did not say anything, just looked at him with an expectation that he would explain himself, that he would justify this interruption. Chandler opened his mouth and found he had no words. Everything he might have said felt inadequate or insane. Finally, he managed to force something out, his voice shaking with disbelief and dawning horror. "Tiana? Oh my God, T. What? You kept the baby?" The question hung between them, and Chandler realized immediately how it sounded. Accusatory, almost betrayed, as if she had done something wrong by not following the script he had written in his head. Tiana's jaw tightened, and when she spoke, her voice was cold and measured, each word delivered with surgical precision. "Her name is Skylar. And yes, I kept our daughter. Alone." The emphasis on that last word cut through him like a blade. Our daughter. He had a daughter. This was not theoretical or abstract, or something that might have happened in an alternate timeline. This was real. This child existed, had existed for months while he closed funding rounds and hired engineers and convinced himself that everything had worked out for the best. Skylar. Tiana had named her Skylar, and he had not been there to have any input, to hold her in the hospital, to see her take her first breath. He tried to speak again, but nothing came out. His throat had closed completely. Tiana watched him struggle, and there was no satisfaction in her expression, no vindication or anger. Just a deep exhaustion and something that might have been pity. She shifted Skylar slightly in the carrier, and the movement seemed to break whatever spell had frozen them both. "I need to go," Tiana said quietly. "She needs to eat soon, and I have a long drive home." Home. Not their home in Pasadena. Whatever home she had now, wherever she was living with their daughter while he slept alone in his sterile loft. Chandler reached out instinctively, not quite touching her arm but close enough that she stepped back. The rejection was automatic and complete. "Wait, please," he managed, his voice cracking. "I did not know. I thought. I assumed." "You assumed I would do what you wanted," Tiana finished for him, her tone flat. "You assumed that if you disappeared and blocked my number and pretended hard enough, your problem would just go away. You assumed wrong." Each sentence landed like a physical blow. Chandler felt his eyes burning, his chest constricting. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it had not been like that, except it had been exactly like that. He had blocked her. He had disappeared. He had assumed she would terminate the pregnancy rather than face single motherhood. He had gambled on her breaking, and she had not broken. She had carried their child alone through every doctor's appointment, every moment of fear and morning sickness and pain, and given birth without him because he had made it clear he would rather lose them both than adjust his plans. "Can we talk?" he asked desperately. "Please, T. Can I buy you coffee? Can we sit down somewhere?" Tiana looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she glanced down at Skylar, still sleeping peacefully against her chest, oblivious to the fact that she was meeting her father for the first time. When Tiana looked back up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "You gave up the right to my time 8 months ago when you walked out. You do not get to show up at a farmer's market and demand a conversation because you are suddenly shocked by the consequences of your own choices. She moved around him, pushing the stroller with controlled grace, and this time Chandler did not follow. He stood there among the Saturday morning shoppers, watching her walk away with his daughter, and felt the full weight of what he had done finally crash over him. He had not just left his wife. He had abandoned his child before she was born. He had missed everything. Her birth, her first weeks of life, the sound of her crying and the weight of her in his arms, and the moment she first opened her eyes. All of it gone. Irretrievable. People moved around him, continuing their normal weekend activities, walking dogs and meeting friends for coffee and enjoying the November sunshine. Someone brushed past him without a second glance. The world kept turning, indifferent to the fact that his entire reality had just shattered. Chandler stood there for another minute, maybe longer, his vision blurring, his hands shaking. Then he turned and walked back to his car, which was still sitting in the middle of the lane with the door wide open. He climbed in, pulled over to the curb properly, and sat there in a daze, leaving behind any illusion that he was still the person he had been an hour ago. Everything had changed. And for the first time since that night in March when he had issued his ultimatum, Chandler understood with absolute clarity that he had made the worst mistake of his life. Chandler did not remember the drive back to his loft. He must have gotten in his car, must have navigated the streets of Oakland and crossed back into Los Angeles, must have parked in his building's underground garage and taken the elevator up to the 7th floor. But none of it registered. His mind was somewhere else entirely, trapped in an endless loop of that moment at the farmer's market. Tiana's face. The baby's tiny fist. Her name, Skylar. He unlocked his door and stepped into the pristine emptiness of his apartment. The cleaning service he had scheduled had come through after all. Everything was spotless and organized and utterly sterile. He looked around at the exposed brick walls, the expensive furniture he had never bothered to personalize, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of a city he suddenly felt completely disconnected from. This was what he had chosen. This lonely box in the sky, this freedom that tasted like ashes in his mouth. He made it to the couch before his legs gave out. He sat down heavily and just stared at the wall across from him, his mind refusing to process anything beyond the most basic observation. He had a daughter. 8 weeks old, maybe 9. Which meant Tiana had given birth sometime in late September or early October, while he had been celebrating the close of their funding round. While he had been hiring new engineers and taking potential clients out to expensive dinners and going on forgettable dates with women whose names he could barely remember now. The timeline started to reconstruct itself in his head, and each piece that fell into place made it harder to breathe. March was when Tiana told him about the pregnancy. She had been 6 weeks along then, which meant she would have been due in November. But the baby looked about 2 months old now, which suggested she had come early or maybe right on time in late September. Chandler tried to remember what he had been doing in late September. There had been the all-hands meeting where he announced the successful funding round. There had been that weekend in San Francisco meeting with potential partners. There had been drinks with Darius and the engineering team to celebrate finally having breathing room. While Tiana had been in labor. While she had been going through contractions and fear and the terrifying reality of bringing a human being into the world. She had done all of that alone because he had blocked her number and convinced himself she would make a different choice. Chandler stood up abruptly and went to the kitchen, thinking water might help, might ground him somehow. But when he turned on the faucet, his hands were shaking so badly he could not hold the glass. It slipped from his fingers and shattered in the sink. He stared at the broken pieces, at his own hands that suddenly felt like they belonged to a stranger, and something inside him finally broke open. He gripped the edge of the counter and gasped for air, his chest heaving. The shame was physical, overwhelming, suffocating. It pressed down on him from all sides until he thought he might actually collapse under the weight of it. He was a father. He had a daughter named Skylar. And he had abandoned them both based on an assumption so arrogant and self-serving that he could not believe he had actually lived with it for 8 months. He thought about all those prenatal appointments Tiana must have attended alone. Sitting in waiting rooms filled with couples, watching other men place their hands on their partners' bellies, listening to heartbeats and asking doctors questions together. She had done all of that by herself while he was in investor meetings talking about growth trajectories and market penetration. She had felt their daughter kick for the first time with no one there to share the moment. She had probably cried herself to sleep more nights than he could count, terrified and exhausted and completely alone. And the birth. God, the birth. Chandler had never thought much about childbirth before, had always vaguely assumed it was something that happened in hospitals with professionals managing everything. But now he could not stop imagining it. Tiana in a hospital gown, in pain, frightened, going through hours of labor with no one holding her hand or telling her she was doing great or advocating for her with the medical staff. Had she called anyone? Her mother, maybe, or her best friend Lakeisha. Or had she been too proud, too determined to prove she could handle it on her own? The thought of her driving herself to the hospital when labor started made him physically ill. The thought of her filling out admission paperwork between contractions, of her making medical decisions alone while scared and in pain, of her holding their daughter for the first time with no one there to share the joy and terror of that moment. All of it, every single piece, was his fault. He moved to the couch and sat down again, his body feeling too heavy to support itself. The apartment was completely silent except for the muted sounds of the city outside. He picked up his phone and stared at it, realizing he did not even have Tiana's number anymore. He had blocked and deleted it months ago to avoid what he had called drama, to avoid accountability, to avoid having to face what he was doing. The next 2 days passed in a fog. Chandler called in sick to work for the first time since founding the company. He ignored texts from Darius asking if he was okay. He could not bring himself to eat more than a few bites of the takeout he ordered and then abandoned. He could not sleep for more than an hour at a time before jerking awake, his mind flooding with images of Tiana pregnant and alone, of the baby he had never met, of all the moments he could never get back. On Sunday night, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, staring at a blank search bar. He wanted to look up Tiana's social media, to see if there were pictures of the baby, to get any glimpse into the life he had been shut out of. But his fingers would not type. He did not have the right to look. He did not have the right to anything. The shame morphed into something else as the hours wore on. Grief, maybe, or a kind of anguish he had never experienced before. He had made a mistake. Not a small one, not the kind you could apologize for and move past. He had made the kind of mistake that permanently altered the course of multiple lives. He had rejected his own child before she existed. He had abandoned his wife when she needed him most. He had prioritized his startup and his freedom and his carefully controlled life plan over the most fundamental human responsibility that existed. And the worst part, the part that made him want to crawl out of his own skin, was that he had done it all while convincing himself he was being rational, mature, logical. He had dressed up his cowardice in the language of pragmatism and convinced himself he was making the hard but necessary choice. He had been so certain of his own righteousness, so confident that Tiana would eventually see things his way. He had been so wrong about everything that mattered. By Monday morning, Chandler had not slept more than 3 hours total. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. His eyes were bloodshot, his face hollow. He looked like someone who had been through trauma, and he supposed in a way he had. Except he was not the victim here. He was the one who had caused the trauma. He knew he could not go on like this. He could not sit in his apartment falling apart while Tiana raised their daughter 17 miles away. But he also had no idea what to do next. How did you apologize for something like this? How did you ask for forgiveness when you had committed the unforgivable? How did you tell someone that you had been catastrophically wrong about everything? The answer came to him slowly over those dark days. He could not fix this. He could not undo what he had done or reclaim the time he had lost. But he could stop hiding. He could face what he had done and accept whatever consequences came with it. He could try, even knowing he might fail, to be present for his daughter now, even though he had not been there at the beginning. He picked up his phone and opened his contacts, scrolling until he found Darius's number. If anyone might know how to reach Tiana, it would be someone in her circle. And he was going to have to swallow his pride, admit what he had done, and ask for help from people who would have every right to slam doors in his face. The shame did not go away. It settled into his bones like a permanent weight he would carry for the rest of his life. But beneath it, fragile and uncertain, was something else. Not hope exactly. Maybe just determination. The determination to stop running, to stop hiding behind blocked numbers and convenient assumptions, and to finally face the truth of what he had done. He had a daughter. Her name was Skylar. And somehow, he had to find a way to be her father, even though he had already failed her in the worst way possible before she had even taken her first breath. 2 weeks after the farmer's market, Chandler finally worked up the courage to reach out to Lakeisha Sullivan. He found her through LinkedIn, a professional profile that listed her as a marketing director at a tech company in San Francisco. They had met several times during his marriage to Tiana, enough that Lakeisha would remember him, though probably not fondly. He sent a message that took him an hour to write, asking if they could talk. He did not expect a response. When one came 3 days later, terse and cold, agreeing to meet for 30 minutes at a coffee shop in Oakland, he felt both relief and terror. Lakeisha was already seated when he arrived, her expression making it clear this was not a social call. She did not stand when he approached, did not offer any greeting beyond a curt nod toward the empty chair across from her. Chandler sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, and started to speak. She cut him off immediately. "I am only here because Tiana does not know I am meeting you, and I want to keep it that way. You have 30 minutes. Use them wisely." Her voice was hard, controlled anger simmering just beneath the surface. Chandler nodded and asked the only question that mattered. He wanted to know what had happened, what Tiana had gone through, because he had not been there and he needed to understand the full scope of what he had done. Lakeisha stared at him for a long moment, her jaw working like she was deciding whether he deserved even this much. Then she started talking, and every word felt like a knife sliding between his ribs. She told him about the first trimester, how Tiana had been sick every morning but still had to finalize divorce paperwork and meet with lawyers. How she had cried herself to sleep most nights in a condo that still smelled like him, surrounded by the ghost of their life together. How she had gone to her first ultrasound alone and heard the heartbeat with no one to share the moment. Lakeisha's voice never wavered, never softened, as she detailed exactly what abandonment looked like in practice. Tiana had worked until the day before her due date, taking on extra freelance projects to save money because she knew maternity leave meant no income. She had installed the car seat by herself, watching YouTube tutorials in her driveway. She had packed her hospital bag alone, including items for the baby she would meet soon with no partner beside her. Then Lakeisha described the birth, and Chandler felt something crack open inside his chest. Tiana had gone into labor at 3 in the morning. She had called Lakeisha, but Lakeisha was in San Francisco and could not make it in time. So Tiana had driven herself to the hospital, timing contractions at red lights, terrified she would not make it. She had checked herself in, endured 14 hours of labor, and given birth to Skylar with only nurses for support. She hemorrhaged during delivery, Lakeisha said flatly. They had to give her a transfusion. She was scared she was going to die and leave her baby an orphan before Skylar even took her first breath. Chandler felt tears streaming down his face, but he did not move to wipe them away. Lakeisha was not done. She told him about the aftermath. The sleepless nights with no one to share feeding duties. The postpartum depression Tiana fought through while building her freelance business back up. The exhaustion so profound that Tiana sometimes cried while changing diapers just from the weight of doing everything alone. And then Lakeisha delivered the final blow. Despite everything, despite being abandoned while pregnant and terrified, Tiana had refused to destroy Chandler's reputation. When friends asked about the divorce, she said they had wanted different things. She never mentioned the pregnancy or the ultimatum or the way he had blocked her number and disappeared. She protected him even after he had failed to protect her. "She is a better person than you deserved," Lakeisha said, standing up. "And if you are here because you want absolution or because you think you can walk back into her life, save yourself the trip. She does not need you. She never did." She left him sitting there, and Chandler understood that this was his truth now. Not the version he had told himself, but the real one. The one where he was not the rational man making hard choices, but the coward who had abandoned his family and been forgiven by the person who owed him nothing. Chandler stood outside the Pasadena condo for 20 minutes before he found the courage to knock. He had driven there directly from his meeting with Lakeisha, stopping only to buy flowers from a grocery store because showing up empty-handed felt wrong, though he knew flowers could not possibly be enough. The bouquet felt absurd in his hands now, a pathetic gesture given the magnitude of what he had done. But he was here, and turning back was not an option anymore. He knocked softly, then waited. Footsteps approached, slow and cautious, and then the door opened just enough for Tiana to see who it was. Her expression shifted from neutral to exhausted resignation in the span of a second. She looked at him, then at the flowers, then back at his face with something that might have been pity. "She just went down for a nap," Tiana said quietly, her voice flat. "If you wake her up, you are leaving immediately." She opened the door wider and stepped aside, not inviting him in so much as containing the situation. Chandler walked into what used to be their home and felt the air leave his lungs. Everything was different. The furniture had been rearranged. There was a bouncer seat in the living room, a basket of baby blankets on the couch, tiny clothes drying on a rack near the window. The life she had built without him was everywhere, tangible proof of his absence. Tiana closed the door and took the flowers from him without comment, setting them on the kitchen counter like an afterthought. She did not offer him a seat, did not offer anything. She just stood there waiting for him to explain why he had come, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. She looked thinner than he remembered, tired in a way that went bone deep, but there was also a strength in her posture that had not been there before. Motherhood had changed her. Hardship had changed her. Chandler tried to speak and found his throat had closed. He forced the words out anyway, stammering and broken. He told her he was sorry, that he had been wrong about everything, that seeing her at the farmer's market had destroyed every lie he had been telling himself. He said he understood now what he had done, that Lakeisha had told him some of what Tiana had been through, and that the shame was eating him alive. His voice cracked and the tears came, and he did not try to stop them. He told her he wanted to be involved, that he wanted to know his daughter, that he would do whatever it took to make this right even though he knew right was probably impossible now. Tiana listened without interrupting, her face impassive. When he finally ran out of words and stood there shaking and crying in the middle of her living room, she let the silence stretch for a long moment. Then she spoke, and her calmness was more devastating than any anger could have been. She told him he had not been there when she vomited every morning for 3 months while trying to finalize their divorce. He had not been there when her back ached so badly during her third trimester that she could barely stand, when she had to install a car seat by herself, when she lay awake at night terrified that something would go wrong and she would be alone. He had not been there when she hemorrhaged during delivery and genuinely believed she might die without ever seeing her daughter take a breath. He had not been there for the first smile, the first time Skylar slept for more than 2 hours straight, the pediatrician visits and the late-night panic when the baby's temperature spiked. She told him all of this in the same measured tone she might use to recite a grocery list, and somehow that made it worse. There was no rage, no bitterness, just a factual accounting of his failures laid out with brutal clarity. When she finished, she looked at him with eyes that held no malice, only exhaustion and a kind of sorrow that had nothing to do with him anymore. "You can be a father if you prove you are serious," she said finally. "But understand this, Chandler. We will never be a couple again. I will never trust you with my heart, and I will never let you hurt our daughter the way you hurt me. If you want to be in Skylar's life, you will show up consistently, you will follow the boundaries I set, and you will accept that forgiveness is not something you get to demand or expect. You abandoned us. That does not just go away because you finally feel guilty about it." Chandler nodded through his tears, unable to form words. Tiana walked to the door and opened it, the conversation clearly over. As he moved past her, she spoke one more time, her voice barely above a whisper. "She deserves better than what you gave us. If you cannot be that, then do not come back." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Chandler stood in the hallway understanding that everything he had lost was permanent. But there was still one thing left that he could fight for. One relationship he had not completely destroyed yet, even though he had never given it a chance to begin. If you are enjoying this story, let us know in the comments. And make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss what happens next. Because the hardest test was still ahead. Chandler was about to meet his daughter for the first time, and that moment would either break him completely or finally give him a reason to become the man he should have been all along. Chandler arrived at the Pasadena condo at exactly 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, the time Tiana had specified in her brief text message. He had been awake since 4 that morning, too nervous to sleep, running through every possible way this could go wrong. He had researched how to hold a newborn, watched videos on supporting their head and neck, read articles about bonding with infants. None of it felt like enough preparation for what he was about to do. Tiana answered the door with Skylar in her arms, and standing behind her was Jasmine Gauthier, one of Tiana's oldest friends. Jasmine's expression made it immediately clear that she was not there for pleasantries. She was there as a witness, as protection, as insurance that Chandler would not overstep or cause harm. He nodded at her in acknowledgement, and she returned it with the barest flicker of recognition, her arms crossed over her chest. The living room had been arranged deliberately. A chair sat in the center with good light from the window, a burp cloth draped over the armrest. Tiana gestured for him to sit there, her movements efficient and businesslike, as if this were a transaction rather than the first meeting between a father and his child. Chandler sat down carefully, his hands already shaking, his heart hammering so hard he thought everyone in the room must be able to hear it. Tiana stood in front of him holding Skylar, who was awake and calm, her dark eyes unfocused in that way newborns had. She was wearing a onesie covered in tiny elephants, her head wrapped in a soft cotton cap that framed her perfect face. Chandler could not breathe. This was his daughter. This living, breathing person had come from him, carried inside Tiana for 9 months, brought into the world through pain and effort he had not witnessed. She was real. She existed. And he was about to hold her. Tiana spoke quietly, giving him instructions. Support the head and neck. Keep one arm under her bottom and legs. Do not bounce or jiggle. If she cries, hand her back immediately. Chandler nodded at each direction, barely processing the words, entirely focused on the small bundle in Tiana's arms. Then Tiana leaned down and carefully transferred Skylar into his waiting hands. The weight surprised him. She was heavier than he expected, but also somehow impossibly fragile, like she was made of something more delicate than flesh and bone. He adjusted his arms the way the videos had shown him, cradling her against his chest, and Skylar blinked up at him with those unfocused dark eyes that were somehow also examining him with an intensity that made him want to sob. She was perfect. Devastatingly, heartbreakingly perfect. She had Tiana's nose, small and slightly upturned. She had what looked like his chin and jawline, already visible even at this age. Her skin was warm and impossibly soft, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. And her hair, dark and curly just like his, stuck out in every direction under the little cap. She was a piece of him and a piece of Tiana, a human being they had created together, and he had almost thrown her away before she existed. Chandler stared at her, unable to look away, unable to do anything but take in every detail. Her miniature fingernails. The way her mouth moved slightly even though she was not crying or eating. The tiny wrinkle between her eyebrows that appeared when she seemed to be concentrating. Then she shifted in his arms, and her hand escaped from the swaddle, reaching up instinctively. Her fingers brushed against his thumb, and then, with the automatic reflex all babies had, she wrapped her entire tiny hand around it and held on. That was when something inside Chandler shattered completely. He understood, with a clarity that went beyond words or logic, that this was the most important thing he would ever be responsible for. Not his startup. Not his investments or his reputation or his carefully constructed life plan. This child. This person who had done nothing to deserve his rejection, who existed despite his worst choices, who had been wanted by her mother even when her father had walked away. The tears came suddenly and would not stop. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as he sat there holding his daughter, trying desperately not to jostle her, trying to maintain the careful position Tiana had shown him even though his entire body was breaking down. Skylar's fingers stayed wrapped around his thumb, her grip surprisingly strong for something so small, and Chandler could not stop whispering the same words over and over. "I am sorry. God, I am so sorry. I am so sorry, baby girl. I am so sorry." He was apologizing to Skylar for not being there when she was born, for not protecting her mother during the pregnancy, for choosing his own comfort over her existence. He was apologizing for missing the first 2 months of her life, for not being the father she deserved from the moment she was conceived. He was apologizing for being the kind of man who could abandon his own child and convince himself it was the right decision. Tiana stood across the room watching, her arms now empty, her expression unreadable. Jasmine had moved to stand beside her, and the two women observed in silence as Chandler fell apart holding the baby he should have been holding since the day she arrived. Neither of them offered comfort or condemnation. They simply witnessed, letting the moment be exactly what it was. Skylar made a small sound, not quite a cry but a kind of squeaky protest, and Chandler immediately looked to Tiana in panic. But Tiana shook her head slightly, indicating he should wait, and after a moment Skylar settled again, her eyes starting to drift closed. She was falling asleep in his arms, trusting him with the vulnerability of sleep despite never having known him before this moment. The trust was unearned and undeserved, and it broke something in Chandler that had been holding him together. He looked down at his daughter, at her peaceful face and her tiny hand still gripping his thumb, and made a promise he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to keep. He would be better. He would show up. He would be the father she needed, even if it took him decades to become worthy of the title. He would accept whatever boundaries Tiana set, whatever consequences came from his choices, whatever pain he had to endure as penance. Because this child deserved more than what he had given her, and he was going to spend every day for the rest of his life proving that he could be more. Tiana finally moved forward after what might have been 10 minutes or 30, time having lost all meaning in that small living room. She gently took Skylar from his arms, the transfer smooth and practiced, and Skylar barely stirred. Chandler's arms felt impossibly empty without her weight, like something essential had been removed from his body. "You can come back on Saturday," Tiana said quietly. "Same time. We will do this in small increments until she gets used to you." Chandler nodded, not trusting his voice. He stood on shaking legs and moved toward the door, Jasmine stepping aside to let him pass but never taking her eyes off him. At the threshold, he turned back to look one more time at Skylar, now sleeping against Tiana's shoulder, her little face peaceful and perfect. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice wrecked. "Thank you for letting me meet her." Tiana did not respond, just gave a small nod that acknowledged his words without accepting or rejecting them. The door closed, and Chandler walked to his car knowing he had just experienced the most important moment of his life. Not his wedding day or his first funding round or any of the achievements he had once thought defined him. This. Holding his daughter for the first time and understanding, finally, what actually mattered. He sat in his car for a long time before driving away, staring at his hands that had just held Skylar, feeling the ghost of her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb. He had missed so much already. Her birth, her first days, all the small moments that parents treasured and remembered forever. Those were gone, irretrievable, lost to his own cowardice and selfishness. But she was still here. She existed. And as long as Tiana allowed him the privilege of being in her life, he had a chance to build something from the ruins of what he had destroyed. Not redemption, perhaps. Not forgiveness, certainly not quickly. But maybe, if he was consistent and patient and willing to accept that some damage could never be fully repaired, he could become the father Skylar deserved. Even if he had to earn that title one supervised visit at a time. The change did not happen overnight. It happened in 1,000 small decisions made over 10 years, each one a brick laid in the foundation of the father Chandler was trying to become. He restructured his entire life around his custody schedule. The startup that had once consumed every waking hour became something he managed rather than something that managed him. He hired a CEO to handle day-to-day operations and stepped back into an advisory role that gave him the flexibility to be present for Skylar. He moved out of the downtown loft and into a 2-bedroom apartment in Pasadena, close enough to Tiana's place that custody exchanges did not require an hour of Los Angeles traffic. He took parenting classes, sitting in rooms full of expectant couples while he frantically scribbled notes about developmental milestones and age-appropriate discipline. He started therapy to unpack why he had made the choices he had made, spending sessions confronting the selfishness and fear he had dressed up as logic. The work was painful and humbling, but he did it anyway because Skylar deserved a father who had done the work to become better. He paid more child support than the court required, never argued about expenses, and never missed a custody exchange. He showed up for Skylar's first steps at 14 months, cheering from Tiana's living room while Jasmine recorded the moment on her phone. He was there for her first day of preschool, watching her walk into the classroom with a backpack almost as big as she was. He attended every parent-teacher conference, every kindergarten graduation, every soccer game where she spent more time picking dandelions than chasing the ball. The milestones accumulated. Skylar's first full sentence. Her first lost tooth. The first time she called him Daddy without prompting. Each moment was a gift Chandler knew he had not earned but accepted with gratitude and humility. He took pictures obsessively, afraid of missing anything else, building an archive of the childhood he had almost forfeited entirely. 3 years after that first supervised visit, Tiana started dating Curtis Dunmeyer, a middle school teacher she had met through mutual friends. Chandler felt the expected flash of jealousy, but he swallowed it and did what Skylar needed him to do. He met Curtis, shook his hand, and told him he appreciated anyone who was good to his daughter. When Skylar mentioned that Curtis had taught her to ride a bike, Chandler thanked him sincerely, even though it hurt to know another man had shared that moment with her. The years passed. Skylar grew from a toddler into a bright, confident child who loved science and soccer and reading before bed. She split her time between two homes and seemed to accept the arrangement without resentment, perhaps because both her parents had worked so hard to make it feel normal. Chandler never spoke badly about Tiana in front of Skylar, and Tiana, despite having every right to poison their daughter against him, never revealed the full truth of how he had abandoned them. On Skylar's 10th birthday, at a small party at Tiana's house filled with kids from her class and a homemade cake shaped like a soccer ball, Chandler pulled Tiana aside while Skylar opened presents. He told her something he had been trying to articulate for years. He said he was grateful she had given him the chance to be a father, that she had saved him from himself by refusing to let his worst choice define him forever. Tiana looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she nodded, a simple acknowledgement of his growth that did not erase the past but recognized the distance he had traveled from it. They would never be in love again. That door had closed permanently the night he issued his ultimatum. But they had built something harder and more valuable than romance. Mutual respect. Shared purpose. The knowledge that Skylar had two parents who finally understood what it meant to put her first. As Chandler watched his daughter laugh with her friends, her face bright with joy, he understood that this was redemption. Not the erasure of his failures, but the daily work of showing up despite them. He had been given a second chance he did not deserve, and he had spent 10 years proving he would not waste it. The shame would never fully leave him, but it no longer paralyzed him. It drove him forward instead, a permanent reminder of the man he refused to be ever again. Hit subscribe if you believe children deserve parents who show up, not parents who abandon them when things get inconvenient. Only people like Chandler in those first 8 months, blocking numbers and hiding from responsibility, would walk away from this story without learning something. Don't be like the man he was. Subscribe if you stand for accountability and second chances earned through action, not words. And if you believe that abandoning your family is never the answer, no matter how scared you are, comment, "I believe in showing up." Don't side with cowards who put their comfort over their children's lives.